Super C, shooting first and forget about the questions. And welcome to Nostalgia, a chronological exploration of every NES game released in North America. I'm Mike.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Joe.
They
I really
don't
like
make
that.
Yeah, they don't make back of the boxes like that anymore.
That's like truly badass.
I had a very small issue with it. And no, I think it's very badass, but shooting first and what was it? Don't
And forget about the questions.
forget about the questions. I feel like it should either be shoot first and forget about the questions or shooting first and forgetting about the questions. But to mix them like that it felt weird.
Sure, but it's also probably like,
How badass do I sound right now?
Right. I think like they actually were trying to weed out people like you who cared about that kind of stuff because they just knew that like, oh, well, if he cares about that, he's going to care a lot more about he's probably going to make a whole like 60-minute podcast about this someday.
Yeah. I got to get over to like Sesame Street ABC or something. This is not my game.
So Super C, the C is for Contra. Did you guys know it was going to be Contra?
Only because you told me. I did not know, and I don't think that, like, at this point, I mean, maybe, I don't know how long after the arcade games this came out, and maybe that, like, that means that they think they can get away with that, but if, just going by what I know about Contra, and trying to put myself into a 1990s shoes, I wouldn't have known. You know, like, Mortal Kombat can just be called, like, MK11. But that's because it's been going on for so long. I think this is a little early to try and, like, give yourself shorthand.
Yeah, you can't take over the whole letter C.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, that too. But I have, on multiple occasions, been like, Super C, I wonder what that is. And then looked it up and been like, oh, it's Contra. And then I just do it again and again every time. So I don't know, I keep wiping my memory of it.
The funny thing, Sean, is that, this is made by Konami, a Japanese company, and for the original Japanese release of this game, it was called Super Contra, The Alien Strikes Back. So not only did they cut the Entra to just make it Super C, but they also cut the subtitle, The Alien Strikes Back, which I think is a fun nod to, like, The Empire Strikes Back and the Alien movies and all that. So, like, why not?
Yeah.
But instead, we got Super C, and honestly, I think, there's not, if you played Contra, I don't think it's like, it takes a while for this to click. I think you realize at the start of the game that you're now in a Contra game, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, even just the typeface of the C is like, oh, it's Contra.
So how did they change the Contra formula in this game? Or did they change the Contra formula?
Well, remind me, in the original Contra, I remember those forward levels where you're like running into the screen as best as they could simulate. But were there actual vertical scrolling levels?
I don't think so.
I didn't think so either.
What do you mean by vertical scrolling levels?
Well, like, so there's like commando type levels.
Oh yeah, no, those were not right. Overhead, top down, right? Yeah,
yeah, top down, but you are moving vertically.
Yeah, I was gonna say that there's definitely verticality in the stages of both these games, but yes, that top down is the new replacement for the pseudo 3D, the kind of over the shoulder, but realistically, for the NES games, it was more like over the character style 3D games that the NES was capable of. That's what the first Contra had. This Super C introduced these top-down levels that, I guess provide a little bit more of a shmup feeling to them, but also more of a commando feeling to them. Let's start there. Did you miss the pseudo 3D stages, or was this a welcome improvement?
Yeah, I actually do think it was a bit of an improvement. I did like the novelty of the over-the-shoulder sections in the first one, but I think here, like, they're using much more like of a tried and true method of switching up the gameplay style. I know that actually kind of makes it sound a bit more boring, but it still felt like a refreshing change from level to level.
Yeah, when I was playing, I felt similarly. I enjoy this style of game better than the that over-the-shoulder style in the first game, but it wasn't really until this conversation right now that I did start to sort of miss that a little bit. Not that I would want it to replace these levels, but it was kind of cool because it was more of a gameplay change-up, where it was like it felt a little more like a bonus level or like an arcade sort of like test your skill moment, because you had to like take out those enemies, protect yourself, and then it would just kind of progress you. I don't know. I definitely think this is an improvement, but I wouldn't have hated having those in here too as like little segues between levels.
Yeah, Joe, I think you're right about missing them, because this is an improvement in the control category. It's much easier to control top-down, not only because we're familiar with it in other video games, but also just in the Contra scheme of things, the way, run and gun games work. It's like it changes the formula this way the stages don't get stale, but it also is like the same kind of combat mechanics and thinking, whereas the pseudo 3D stages in the first game were maybe a little more aiming was a little more difficult than it needed to be, and maybe like just NES graphics aside, like awareness of what was going on and how many things were coming at you was also kind of hard. All that to say that I really did like those stages, and so yeah, I would agree. I miss them here. I don't see why you couldn't have included it even as just a bonus stage, a fun thing to collect an additional life or something that's sorely needed in a game as difficult as this. But Contra 3 on the Super Nintendo will kind of like work off of that top-down format, and also take the mode 7 instead of the fake 3D over the shoulder. It'll use mode 7 with the top down.
One thing I liked about, I guess, just the philosophy of trying to change things up is that even when it goes back to, the standard sort of side-scrolling elements, like the default movement method, like each level is still unique, and it's never like outlasting. It's welcome. It kind of feels like this game is just like a shut up and play the hits sort of thing. Like there's no filler. Like there's a vertical like elevator level, and then there's one where it's a bunch of like going up hills, and you got to jump over chasms, and then there's like the levels where you're in like more of like a lab, and there's like little set pieces that aren't actually bosses. Like there's a lot going on. It's never just move to the right and jump once in a while.
Yeah, each portion of each level feels very deliberately and distinctly designed.
As someone who really enjoys the first Contra game, that game, the way it starts, automatically like throws you into all different kinds of platforming, action, verticality, and horizontal movement in the very first stage. This game was a bit of a slow burn. At first, I was like, oh my god, are they removing the verticality of these stages? Because the scale just felt smaller, even though the graphics are the same size. Like I was comparing, I'm like, okay, I think the guy that you play as is the same exact sprite, probably with some upgrades as the first game. So why does he feel smaller to me? And as you continue to play the levels, you're like, oh, okay, it was just whatever. It was just like a notion I had that turned out not to be true. Yes, this game even introduces the verticality like a step further with the slopes now. There in the first game, it was only ever straight platforms that you would just kind of hop up on top of. With the slopes now, they're introducing both rolling rocks and enemies rushing down at you. So the slopes and the stage design in general is just a little more evolved than the first Contra game was. If it just takes maybe a while to get going, and then also once it gets going, it really just continues to introduce new things on top of that. Sean, you were talking about the elevator stage, and I do think those kinds of things, even if they're like small set pieces, they remind me back to Double Dragon 2, where it's like, yeah, it's great that this isn't like, okay, every 3 stages there's an elevator level, right? Like you don't need that.
No. And what I really liked about the slope stages too was just that little polish where they're like, well, it would look kind of dumb if he's laying prone like into the ground and his like feet are sticking out. So they just give you a whole new like crouch sprite, and I just appreciated that little extra polish there.
And the first game kind of starts with you thinking like, oh, it's I'm fighting in the Vietnam War maybe or something, like, or some kind of unnamed war or whatever. I'm in the jungles. You're just, we've been trained with that with so many NES games before it. And then it kind of does this slow descent into madness where you're going like into the alien base and things become a lot more grotesque and the enemies start to evolve. First you were fighting machines, now you're fighting like aliens mixed with machines. Very uncomfortable stuff, especially for when those were the top of the line graphics at the time.
Mouths are forming under your feet.
Right. So Super C takes that and obviously expands on it. The aliens are striking back, to use the original Japanese release's title. How is that descent this time? Is it like aliens right away, or is it, is it another slow burn? Is it kind of like you're going deeper into the jungle?
It escalates pretty quickly.
Yeah. It's funny because I forgot while I was playing that like we were going to go into like alien territory.
Yeah, it goes from pretty standard fare to, standard laboratory high tech base fare. Straight into Geiger again, with some extra like goofy, like, yeah, there are mouths that will open up under your feet. There's some pretty like metal imagery, especially in the bosses. I think that like it wasn't as much of a surprise now, because when you think of Contra, you just think of this is the route it's going to take. Like, this is where we're going with this. I guess I really like that as a tradition.
Yeah, I don't. So in the original, was it like a slower descent into madness, or was it like this where it was just as abrupt?
You knew you were fighting aliens kind of like early on, but it wasn't until I think the final two stages where you're actually like in the alien nest or whatever, and like you're no longer like fighting in the jungles.
I don't think there was a section of Contra 1 where you actually have to like work through the partially digested material of a giant alien, which is I think what we did at one point here.
Yeah, this is kind of like what was that shmup we played, Abadox, where like you're going inside the alien planet, and obviously there's crazy visuals in there. I think it's a plus to have these kinds of insane visuals where it's not, this game can't get an M rating or anything like that. Probably not even back then because the ESRB didn't exist, but just like the more extreme, the better here. And I do think, especially from where it starts, the game still has a kind of wow factor to it as the bosses continue to evolve. Because first you're fighting like guys in tanks,
Mm-hmm.
and by the end of it, Sean, as you were mentioning, like, mouths are coming out of the floors and trying to swallow you whole. Like, that's some really crazy imagery.
Yeah, the boss design that I think I like the most. Well, the boss design in terms of just like how you kind of interact with the boss that I like the most was a much more a much less heavy metal. The spider tank thing. I liked that. You try not to step on these things because you're just going to get hit, but you realize very quickly that you're going to have to jump on top of this tank. But obviously you can't actually hurt it from up there, so you have to like jump on and off as you see fit. But in terms of visual design, I really liked the one that kind of looked like the space jockey from Alien eating like a woman. I don't know. It was like a woman's face, but there was like a weird skull thing on top of it, and it shot like weird red bulbs at you. I just really liked the image of that.
Yeah, that's like the final boss, right? That's the.
Is it the final boss?
I think it is. Yeah. Or it's like
it's the final.
Like, it looks like a woman's face. Like, yeah, she's like just being completely devoured by this monster, and like just her face is sticking out of its mouth or something.
Yeah. Okay. I guess that was the final boss.
Very cool.
Yeah, like what's the plan there? Were the aliens trying to do the massive? No, were they doing like the Mass Effect 2 route of like we're gonna make a human Reaper, like we're gonna make a human alien? Like it looks like they're like finishing swallowing a human to like make one of their own or something, and the next evolution of aliens. That's what I was thinking of too with the descent to not madness, but like alienity or whatever. If I'm making up words, just like other video games that do that, either good or bad. Mass Effect 2 kind of came to mind as one that didn't quite deliver on that. Like the ending zone was really cool, where you have to like make choices based on your team and how well you know them, and anybody can die. But the actual like, oh, we made a human Reaper as the final boss thing wasn't like
that was
cool
pretty
at all.
lame. Yeah.
I want to backtrack though just a little bit. You were talking about like how you start out with these just guys in tanks and just these people we're fighting, and then we go into the aliens. Who are these people? Is it in the manual? Are they like just on the alien side? Who are these like military people you're fighting at the beginning?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know that the manual does have a good explanation for a lot of things, like what Mad Dog and Scorpion were doing right before the game started. Spoiler alert, they were on a beach in Rio with a bunch of native lovelies. But I couldn't quite read through the whole thing to understand the army thing here, but surely the army is like probably, if this is like a twist of sorts, I don't think they're working with the aliens. They probably are just trying to harness the power as well or whatever.
Yeah, I have a theory, and again, I probably can have it confirmed or refuted by just reading the manual. But near the end of the game, there's this repeating like background sprite work that it's sort of lining the walls and floors and ceilings of a very human-looking figure with like hoses coming in and out of them. So I want to say that they kidnapped a bunch of people and then huskified them to borrow from Mass Effect, and now they're all dressed up in military garb and they're fighting you. That's just my uninformed theory.
Well, you've given me enough time now to look it all up, and so the manual says that not only is Red Falcon, that's the guy, the big bad alien that we took down in the first game, not only is he back, but he's basically commanded an army of intergalactic warriors to seep into the brains of not just any soldiers, but the U.S. Army specifically.
Oh.
And it's a mind contamination trick, which has already taken command of U.S. forces at Fort Firestorm. So there you go. There's the answer. They're not confused and trying to harness the power of the aliens, although that would probably be like a Kojima twist, right? That like the U.S. Army knows about the aliens on Earth and is trying to secretly like harness their technology to get the one-up on Russia or something.
Well, the U.S. Army has been commanded by an alien since late World War One, would be the Kojima thing.
There's a very safe bet for you as a time period. I don't think we have any World War One listeners here, so nobody would be offended by the time period you chose. And moving on, so we talked about, what's different for Super C from Contra. But, is the game actually that different? Like, I'm not saying, don't fix it if it ain't broke. But, like, does it feel like I feel like all the same power-ups are here. The way you acquire the power-ups is the same. What the power-ups do are the same. The way you shoot is the same. That's kind of like unusual, I guess is what I'm saying. I'm not trying to complain. I'm saying it's kind of unusual in these NES games where sequels usually mean like, nah, scrap it, whole new game. This one, it's a puzzle game.
Yeah, that's something though that I noticed a lot, and I think for me it works in its favor. I still could have done with some more changes. I wouldn't have said no to, but yeah, I feel like in this era, a lot of the games that we've considered really good, in their second time around, they make a totally different game. I mean, like Super Mario Brothers 2. I mean, obviously that has its own story behind its development, but like Castlevania, Zelda 2, and all this, and like to varying results. And I guess this is just like, to me, not that those are bad games, but to me, this is just like proving that like you can also just take something that works and improve on it rather than trying to make something totally new. Like, I think video game sequels have always been able to do what movie sequels have had a hard time doing, in being better than the original very often. And I think that's because it's like, well, you already have your base layer, And whereas like a movie relies on the story, and you probably already kind of tied up the story in the first one, video game has gameplay to fall back on too, and it's like you can take this base layer, and now that it's already done, you can spend your time improving it.
Yeah, I agree. I like that they kept it the same. I guess partially because I just really liked Contra. And they did still try and like iterate on it where, I mean, it's still, they haven't tried to iterate incredibly hard, but that whole thing with changing to the top down as opposed to the over the shoulder, I guess that you could call, depending on who you ask, an improvement. So yeah, I agree with Joe here.
I'm not trying to reiterate a conversation that we've had early on in the podcast, probably 250 episodes ago, about NES difficulty or difficulties at that time and how they had to inflate the games to be harder to make them last longer. And so this way you couldn't just rent them and beat them overnight. But it is worth revisiting here now as we are in the 1990s and we've seen some longer form games. Super C is a game with only 8 areas, and yet some people probably will never get to the 8th area unless they are very good at Contra-like games, run and guns, because of how hard it is. But in a day and age now where you can play a 20-hour plus game, and the whole game is just very easy, barely manages to challenge you because games have become so accessible and so like, oh, you die? You start right where you died. Don't worry about it, okay? And in fact, we've even tweaked it without you knowing to make the enemies a little easier. Yes, that is something that developers do. Don't you doubt it for a second. They totally, include luck into the game to help you if you die a certain amount of times. Anyway, we get back on topic. Super C is kind of a game that just, could be... I saw the speed run for the game, and it's so fast that it's like, that wasn't my experience. But theoretically, is it okay that the game is just something that you instead persevere on, and that's the fun of the game? Have we had any revised thoughts on this?
I think it is and it isn't. So the design of this game stands out among a lot of other NES games that I would consider NES hard, where a lot of games are NES hard in a way that is unfair or like doesn't feel good. This, like, when I lose normally, I feel like, okay, I could beat that. Like, it gives me that itch to try again because I'm like, oh, I was so close, or like, oh, I know what I could have done there. And I equate it to a modern game to Cuphead. Okay, I play Cuphead, and that game, you start a boss fight, and it's like, well, this is actually impossible. And then you actually learn it, and you actually get better, and it feels good to do that. And I think Contra does that in all ways but 2. And the 2 things that I think work against that for me are, 1, not having unlimited continues. Because, like, yeah, let me start at the beginning of the level every time. If I'm on stage 8 and I die and I have to start back at stage 1, I'm just gonna put down the game. Like, I'm not gonna do all that again. I know that's a product of its time. It's the arcade mentality, but that's number 1. And then number 2 is just, I don't know if you guys felt that there was some very unfair spawning after you die. A lot of times I would spawn, I wouldn't know where I was about to spawn, and I would just spawn like in a bullet, like an enemy bullet, and just die. So like, if those 2 things were fixed, I would think that this difficulty is perfectly balanced and like deliberately hard, but not in like a cheap way.
Yeah, I agree. I had less of an issue with the spawn deaths, but I can definitely see where that would come into play. I think that part of the what makes a game like this palatable is the fact that its controls are so tight, and you don't have problems like in a lot of these games where there's some delay or some like momentum based stuff that really makes the controls harder to handle. And we praise these games that have stuff like that specifically for having a much like momentum based controls, or like, oh, it feels more fluid or something like that. But in a game like this, where it's basically a shmup and a bullet hell and a run and gun all at once, and it's just constant action, I need the controls to be 1-to-1. And I think because that it does actually succeed at that, I don't have as big of a problem with it. When it comes to the amount of content in the game, like the length of the actual game, that's a bit fuzzier. I think this could have helped with maybe one or two extra areas that, I mean, it can't be that much work to do another like totally handcrafted, perfectly balanced level, right? But I still don't. I think it did pretty well for what I think. I would still feel like I wasn't ripped off if I bought this game.
Yeah, I think it's just a product of the time too, because there are games from 1987 that are, like I'm thinking like Metroid, right? And they're super long, sprawling games where you can, create passwords and continue on. And so, like, what's stopping Konami from being the kind of people who make a Contra that's just like, 50 levels, but you have passwords and it's just, sprawling madness or whatever. Just to put some comparison to it, though, all three runs that I'm about to present to you are assume the player never gets hit. And if you assume the player never gets hit in Super C, the game is about 15 minutes long. If you assume the player never gets hit in Super Mario Bros. 2, the game is an hour and 9 minutes long. And if you assume the player never gets hit in Super Mario Bros. 3, the game is 2 hours and 49 minutes long. So there is still like a question of just, what's the goal here, both from a value standpoint and for the player. And I think that these are the kind of questions that just can't age appropriately for this kind of show, because that you can't build them for the future. I think that's why Super Mario Bros. 3 like always holds up, is that regardless, like everybody's always down for 2 hours and 49 minutes of perfect Mario, right? Like we're all cool with that. But, for Super C, like, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes is the sweet spot of like, well, this is if somebody was really, really good at this game, but most of you will probably never even get here and it'll take hours and hours to play. So, just exploring that idea.
Yeah, I think in like early levels of Contra versus early levels of Super Mario Bros. 3, it's a lot more reasonable to not take very many hits in Super Mario Bros. 3 than it is for a casual player in Contra, because like, I mean, I'm speaking as someone who didn't beat the game, so maybe I would get to the end and be like, oh, I that didn't feel long enough. But like, again, I didn't beat the game, and I was still like, it took me a long time to not beat it.
I also think it's a pacing thing, because you can take your time with Mario, but I know that there's time limits to those levels, but you can still sort of take it at your own pace. And in Contra, you really can't sit still, so it's just. There's a lot more. I feel like it would be pretty overwhelming if it was a game that long. I mean, yeah, you can break it up with passwords and whatever, but I guess like if it's a game that you want to beat in a sitting, if you're just really that good at the game, then I think this is an okay length for that. Also going by just what the game is trying to get you to do.
And lastly, let's talk difficulty. So obviously it's fun to talk about the design and the enemies and all the cool stuff in the game. But as Joe mentioned, it's a challenging game that not many people will see the ending of, especially when they do things like remove the Konami code from the game, which was in the original Contra. So it's not like, they just didn't invent it yet. It's been in all sorts of Konami games. They just didn't include it on this one for whatever reason. And then, obviously, to make matters worse, like Joe mentioned, if you run out of lives, you get to continue, but you can only continue 3 times, and then you're actually game overed for good. So forget about the fact that they won't give you the 30 lives. They only give you, like, 10 with a different code, so it's like it doesn't even feel good to put that code in. But then also, once you lose those lives and all that, then you're just stuck on 3 continues and you're out. So it is very challenging in the sense of just scale from the original Contra, like how forgiving that game was in the terms of number of lives and continue system and everything. But what about the actual enemies? I feel like in this game, a lot of the actual challenge just came from weird spawning of enemies. But what I mean is it's like it kind of, you have to have played through it once to know the set pieces kind of well. There was a certain jump in Area 5 that I wrote down because I was like, I'm going to talk about this on the show. Like, this bothers me so much that I'm going to put it down for the show. And what happened is that it's in the slopes in Area 5.
Yeah.
it's a jump that is required by the player that you need to know that you not only have to jump, but then you have to kind of move out of the way because one of those purple rocks is going to fall directly where you have to jump. And that's something that like is unavoidable for the most part the first time it happens to you. It's almost like a jump scare in a movie. And now you have the ability the second time watching the movie to be like, no, wait, never mind, guys. I know that there's a jump scare, so everybody just look away, and everybody looks away, and they don't get scared. It's like the same thing here.
I
don't
never want to watch a movie with you.
Yeah, I know, that's so funny to think about, but I like the analogy, especially since we're recording this in October. So I think this is like a November episode, but we're recording it in October.
I get what you're saying though. That I think that if you have like perfect reaction time, you could probably avoid it. But by now you're probably in some kind of flow state, and you're just trying to like make that perfect jump and not get hit by that projectile. Because at the same time, I know the part you're talking about. There's a guy on the other side of the jump that is shooting at you, and so you're more focused on him. So it's kind of more of it is definitely a jump scare sort of gotcha moment. But I don't really. Again, this is a game about where you're supposed to die a lot. I mean, maybe not supposed to, but in the course of playing the game, you're likely to die a lot. So I don't see it as that cheap.
Yeah, I noticed it, but not so much. I think because while it's definitely like a factor, I think that most games that we've played where that's possible, that happens. like a lot more than this. Like, and I think it's definitely a problem and an issue. And I think I was more pleased that it wasn't happening as much. So, like, I was giving it a pass the times that I did feel like, wow, I couldn't have possibly avoided that, because so much more percentage of the time I felt like, hey, I have agency here. So yeah, not an excuse. Two wrongs don't make a right, Super C, but it didn't bother me quite as much because I was like more pleased in comparison to other games.
Intentional by Konami or not, there is a hustle factor or adrenaline rush to the entire game by the way that enemies spawn in and stuff, and that by that I mean there's like an enemy trap situation if they're not cleared fast enough and you don't move on. To Sean's point about Super Mario Bros. 3, when you kill the Goomba on screen, you can just hang out there and kind of just hit the coin blocks and see what happens and explore to see if there's anything else hidden in the stage. That's not available to you in Super C. There is a constant need to just continue scrolling, to move on, to clear out. Don't kill everything. Kill what's in front of you. Kill what's in your way. Continue to move on, because things will just keep spawning in, but not necessarily in the unfair bullet hell way that we talk about usually with these NES hard games. Just in the sense that there's no time to just kind of relax while you're playing the game. Would you agree?
I think like we complained about that a lot in less deliberately designed games, is what I guess I'll describe them as, where it just seemed like, oh, you killed it, and then another one comes out of the same spawn point immediately after you kill it, and then, okay, you kill it again, and another one comes right back out. Whereas this one, like, it gives you a moment, like, you killed the thing, you did what you're supposed to do, and it's only when you kind of linger that they keep coming. Like, it's definitely a bit more fine-tuned to be more of like an engine to keep you moving than it is just this thing that just keeps happening.
An entire genre of indie games will go on to do this kind of thing, where it's all to an even larger extent. It's rushing, it's fast fingers, it's bullet hells and stuff like that. But Super C is doing it in a way that is both for the casual player, the person who enjoys Super Mario Bros. 3, it's probably a rude awakening for someone like that, someone who plays slower paced games. But for the person who does frequent the arcade and is used to that kind of stuff, I think that there is a accessibility thing here to like taking it home and trying to master it on your own. Again, to my point earlier about just like, now we have 40-hour games that never quite challenge you because you could select the difficulty to just be, well, just tell me the story, or balanced. But balanced is basically just tell me the story too, but make me feel like I'm doing a little more. Unless you're playing on like the hardest difficulty settings, most games aren't that challenging these days. And Super C instead is offering a challenge, that's more familiar to the NES days of just like, can you even beat the game? Like, that's the accomplishment, is like, can you get to the end of the stage? How far can you go? Tell your friends what you saw in the next area. And if difficulty is definitely a factor, then you'll definitely want 2 players for this one. Super C allows for 2-player co-op. Joe, you're usually the guy who does the co-op stuff. Did you do one here?
I did. And I'll say that it's predictably more fun, in my opinion, but also a little bit harder, almost.
Whoa.
Which seems weird because you have 2 players, but it's the inability to both of you at every moment have control of the screen. If one of you falls behind, you got to kind of like wait for the person in front has to sort of wait, and like that causes a lot more deaths than you'd think, because there's a lot of times where it's like you can't see something ahead, or you can't get out of the way because you can't move far enough back and get away from your partner that far. It's even worse when your partner dies, because for some reason you can move even less distance away from where they died once they're dead. Like, you can't even get all the way to the other end of the screen. So there's like this invisible wall that killed me so many times, and killed my friend so many times, because I died very frequently as well. But like, of course, it's just more fun to be like co-oping a game than it is to play single player. But we did notice a few times if like one of us would die and lose all of our lives, there was like a brief moment where like, oh, this is a little easier for the other person.
Which is kind of funny, because I was making the argument that you would think having 2 guns is better than 1. And certainly that's what the game is proposing to you too, by introducing 2 main characters.
And it probably is. It's like your offense is better, but your defense is worse.
I can see that leading to a lot of pitfall deaths.
Exactly, yeah.
Sean, you were asking how hard could it be to create a uniquely balanced stage for the NES, but could I tell you that they actually did that 3 times for this NES version? There are 3 levels exclusive to the NES version that were not in the arcade. The high-tech base, some kind of mountain level, and the alien nest, which are all, you guessed it, the top-down stages. They were not present in the arcade game. They are only in the NES version. And so could you imagine a game that didn't have, that just basically was always side-scrolling action? I can understand why that works in the arcade, but, that's
I mean, I can even see, it's not even just the fact that they're all the same kind of gameplay. Like, I don't expect 2 different kinds of gameplay in a game, but if we're just talking about raw, like length of the game and like just the amount of levels offered, that probably would have been a problem. If it was just the side-scrolling levels, then I might say that, oh, this is just a really short game, and I don't know how much I can recommend a game that short.
Contra, of course, is a classic and is talked about a lot. We've even talked about it a lot to help navigate this Super C conversation, knowing that probably a lot of people who are listening to this show are at least familiar with Contra, if not Super C. And then Contra 3 is also a very well-regarded game, and even got put on the SNES Mini, or whatever they called it, back during that holiday season, where they were just like, yeah, miniature consoles, that's what everybody's doing these days, we'll do it too. Those are both very well-regarded games. Not that Super C is a good or bad game, we'll find that out in a second. Super C seems less talked about, less in the, in the cultural zeitgeist, and I was just wondering, are there any other franchises where the second game in the series is kind of under the radar? It might be easy to say Super Mario Brothers 2, since Super Mario Brothers 3 is more like Super Mario Brothers 1. I don't think that's the answer. I'm actually going to say, to take a page from Joe here, I think Crash Bandicoot 2 is not, it's not that it's the worst game in the trilogy or whatever. It's the under the radar one. Everybody knows the first game. It's the one that launched the franchise. And everybody talks about 3 like it's the second coming of platform video games or something, just because it introduces motorcycle levels. But I don't really hear people talk about Crash 2. Joe, your thoughts?
I have an opinion on that, because I think you're right. Maybe it's because I grew up around other Crash Bandicoot fans. I actually always thought that people underrated the first game because it didn't have all like the bells and whistles and stuff. But you're right. 1 is the one everybody knows because of the launch. 3 is like the most popular one. I always have thought that 3 is the worst of the trilogy. So
Wow.
I don't know how much we want to get into my Crash Bandicoot opinions.
No, I don't think we need to go there. But
maybe we'll get another.
Joe,
podcast
I want to hear it.
about that.
I want to hear it, Joe.
Maybe in the post show.
yeah. Now hold on a second, because I'm sure you also have an answer to my question.
I do. Oh, and here it is. I'll say it now. I think Metal Gear. We played 2 weeks ago, last week. When was that? The second Metal Gear 2, Snake's Revenge. Or
Well,
whatever
that's
the
got
heck
an
that game is called.
asterisk on it too, though.
Yeah, but technically it does exist as a game. Like
That's true. That's true. I thought when you brought up Joe immediately, I thought you were going to talk about Zelda 2.
Well, but Zelda 2 does have like a following, right? You know, it's like maybe that's more recent.
I'm sure there
Like,
are
I know
Crash
it's, like,
Bandicoot 2
had a resurgence.
truthers.
Oh, certainly. But I feel like Zelda 2, like I feel like everybody knows about it. People are hot or cold on it. So maybe if that's the question, that it's like completely like underrated by a lot of people, but like it has like a rabid fan base.
Yeah. Whereas I'd never even heard of this one.
What's that?
Whereas, I
Super
figured that there would
C,
be
yeah.
a Contra 2 because I know of Contra 3.
Right.
But I didn't know it was just going to be called Super C. So I don't know what I'm saying.
Yeah, but no, I mean, I do think that like there's merit to the Zelda 2 version too, but I was trying to look at something like maybe because I didn't know anything about Snake's Revenge, and I actually had a friend of mine play a little bit of it with me, who is a big, outside of you, Sean, probably the biggest Metal Gear fan that I know. And he was like, he had never played it and I think he had heard of it and just heard like it's not real.
Another one I was thinking of, just to help alleviate the conversation a little, Mafia 2. Mafia 1 was a game that I remember, like, take it or leave it, I liked it. It was like my introduction to that Grand Theft Auto style of video game. And then Mafia 3 got like a huge push because it came out much later and it was supposed to be like a GTA clone and everything. And it's definitely more of like, I don't know, it's more removed from that. But apparently Mafia 2 is a game that existed. I just somehow didn't play that one, but I played Mafia and Mafia 3. It's just kind of funny that, like,
yeah, I guess it depends on what circles you travel in on the internet, because I was really hyped about Mafia 2 and then it just didn't run very well on the PC at all, so I just never really played it.
It is hard to get an answer to this question though, because I think, well, here's another one. Far Cry 2. I feel like
Far Cry 2 is great.
I know, but I'm saying, like, Far Cry established the franchise. Far Cry 3 is the one that, like, kind of, at least in my opinion, like, that's when you get the franchise expanded a lot more, and then you have Blood Dragon, and then it, just basically became a major franchise. Far Cry 2 is the one that people just don't talk about. You don't hear a lot of things about Far Cry 2.
I bring up Far Cry 2 on this podcast every other day.
Okay, well, what about BioShock 2?
That's what I was just going to say. I was going to ask you guys about that one, because
I like BioShock 2.
That franchise.
I think BioShock 2 is a fun game.
It's another situation where the PC port was terrible and would crash after the first level, so never really played too much of that one.
Well, the funny thing is like BioShock 2 is like, I'm not willing to die for it here though. I'm agreeing. I think it's in that Super C level of games where it's like, it exists. I had a good time playing it and everything, but when you think about it, it's like the first BioShock was so revolutionary for the time, and then BioShock Infinite obviously was like getting, I think it even got all the Game of the Year accolades for that year, even though now everybody who has an internet subscription is saying that it's the worst game of all time or whatever, because it just didn't hold up or it's overrated now.
It held up.
Yeah, it's a fine game. I'm willing to say that. Yeah, there's like bullet sponges everywhere, but to find me a video game these days that doesn't have that. Anyway, my point being, BioShock 2, fine game.
I got one more. And one that I'm not super familiar with. What about Fable 2? Or no, Fable 3 is the one people don't like. Fable 2
Fable
is the
3
popular
is,
one.
Fable 2 is the good
okay.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, never mind. Forget I said anything.
Joe, Sean, any contributions?
No.
Great. So then that means that rather than drag this on any longer, we will just move into our final segment where we stop talking about if Super C is even a known video game and instead talk about if it should be on the essential games list. I had a great time with Super C. I definitely think it's more Contra, and it expands the game ever so slightly. Like it actually feels like in some ways the game isn't expanding, it's just changing a little bit, and those changes could be for better or for worse. Maybe I've played the original Contra so many times that I'm like not ready for the change, but I don't feel like Super C was the overwhelming improvement over the Contra that's currently on the Essential Games list. It's more like somebody was like, hey, if you want more Contra, you could play this game. But it's not like, it's not definitively better than what I played so many years ago. And so maybe a little controversial, but I am going to say that just for small reasons, like the Konami code not existing and this game being increasingly more challenging, that I would prefer to keep Contra on the Essential Games list for basically the same experience, but a little more accessible in 2023. Sean.
Black and White 2. That's a game that people don't really think of pretty often.
Popular one.
Black and White 2?
I remember
Pokemon
seeing.
you're talking about?
Yeah, I saw. Well, wait,
People
no,
love that
not
one.
the Pokemon game.
Oh. I thought you were talking about Pokemon Black and
Yeah,
White too.
no, you're talking about
Oh.
the simulation game, right? The God simulation game.
Yeah,
whatever?
the God
Yeah.
game.
Oh.
Yeah, I saw a magazine advert for Black and White 2, and I was like, how will I ever play this game? Because I just, we were running like Windows 95 at the time.
Okay, anyway, I had another one, but I forgot what it was. Much like the point of the exercise. But I think there's room enough for 2 Contras on the Essential Games list. Maybe you guys won't. I mean, I know that Mike doesn't agree with me. Maybe Joe will. Maybe he won't. I just like these games enough to say that there's room for both. So I'm going to vote this essential.
Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've had so many conversations about, like, if something in the future does this better, does that mean that it can't be on? And same thing in reverse. And I also feel that this is, even though there's minor improvements, even though it didn't do anything like major to improve over the original, I'd say this is at least as good as the original. And to that sense, like if I'm going to say like, hey, these are the games that I would recommend you play on the NES that hold up today, this has to be there. The only thing that would give me any pause is what I mentioned about the continues, and basically what you said, Mike. Like the slight difficulty, the slightly less accessible because of that difficulty. I understand that maybe being something that would keep it off, but I don't think it's enough. I think this game is just as fun as the original. With like there's a wish list of things that I wish it did, but same thing with original Contra. So I would definitely say this is an essential game.
All right, and with that, we have a new introduction to the Essential Games list, or induction, I should say. No new introduction, same rules.
And I'm Sean.
Yeah, and that's actually, it wasn't that long of a gap. So the most recent Essential Games are seeming to be about 15 episodes apart now, which is great. So you have Super Mario Brothers 3, Terra
It's very
Cresta,
important to Mike
and
that there's enough of a gap.
there has to be rhythm. Yeah, well, think about it. If we put Snoopy's Silly Sports Spectacular on the Essential Games list last week, could we really allow Super C?
Yeah,
You're
that's
right.
why I didn't.
Yeah.
For anybody who's worried about any kind of conspiracy for that, just know that Spy vs. Spy, Super Mario Brothers 2, and Blaster Master all were Essential Games, and that was 3 Essential Games in 4 episodes. So nobody's counting, nobody's keeping a list. All that to say that the Essential Games list continues to expand, and hopefully you guys are liking where the list is going, or if you're not liking it too, that's a good time to write into us and tell us how stupid we are. I've had people say, you guys don't have Excite Bike on the Essential Games list page, and I'm like, oh, you're a new one, you're fresh. Just wait till you find out when we do these games in our best of episodes, because who knows what's going to change in these best of episodes as well. That said, because there's no 15 game rule limit, as Sean seemed to be implying, next week we will play Tecmo World Wrestling, where it will have its shot at the title of Essential Games List.